Well, good morning, everyone. I think it's fair to say that the people of Cornerstone have stepped up in the last 5 or 6 months with these devotions. Some folk have been moved by a particular verse or a particular passage, some by particular events in their lives. I think for me, choosing a particular passage or choosing a particular chapter would be difficult unless I was trying to apply it to a particular situation. But I am drawn to certain characters in the Bible, and I've just finished reading Daniel. Maybe you have certain characters that you find more attractive than others in the Bible, perhaps some favourite characters of your own. Or maybe you feel that there's just too many to choose from. Well, I don't know how many times I've read Daniel, but it seems to me that every time I read it, I'm struck again by his virtues. I suppose if he'd been a character in the Marvel Annual or comic, he may not have been thought to be particularly exciting. After all, he wasn't a Samson who was fighting animals and the Philistines. He wasn't a David or a Joshua who were leaders of armies. But the book of Daniel looks at events which took place in the life of this very godly man, from his teenage years into his latter days when he was an elder statesman. And the book is split into two very clear sections. The first half of the book, of course, deals with the events that we know so very well, and he and his three friends appear quite regularly. The second half of the book explains why we find Daniel placed between the major and the minor prophets in the Old Testament. He is and was a prophet. They make fascinating reading, and they're not easy to interpret, although many theologians have attempted to do so. But I'm going to look at the earlier chapters. The stories set out in these first 6 chapters are some of the best known in the Bible. Indeed, some of them have been the origin of quite a few well-known idioms or well-known phrases in the English language. The lion's den, for example, being thrown into the fire, and the writings on the wall, they all come from Daniel. But what I love about Daniel is his profound wisdom. He also displays great discipline and willpower, and it enables him to resist temptations as the devil attempts to absorb him into the land of Babylon and later into Persian culture. I once heard a great theologian say that Daniel mastered the art of saying no. He added that Daniel's life was an encouragement to those who are tempted to follow the ways of the world. Daniel, he said, was an example of how the more times you say no, the easier it gets. Well, of course, we first encountered Daniel when he was just a teenage boy. He and his friends had been set apart by Nebuchadnezzar from the other exiles of Jerusalem and marked out for future roles in the king's court, what we might call the civil service. How easy it would have been for these 3 young men and Daniel to immerse themselves in all the luxuries offered to them in those early days. But Daniel and his 3 friends said thank you, but no. Now, whilst we don't really know a great deal about Daniel's life throughout his time in the hierarchy of the civil service and the king's court, we do see a couple of snapshots which emphasise the great discernment and wisdom of this godly man. His courage and his honesty seem to me to be truly amazing. He doesn't shrink from telling a variety of kings who literally held his life in their hands, what their failings were and what their miserable futures held. He is a man of truly great integrity, which is summed up in the final chapter of this first part of Daniel in chapter 6. The story of the lion's den is a frightening example of racial hatred and jealousy. Our own Pastor Jonathan was talking about racism just a couple of weeks ago. Well, it was alive and kicking in Daniel's time. There is some confusion about who Darius was. He is named as the king at the time. His name only appears once in our Bibles. However, what we do know is that he was the first monarch of the new Persian and Mede Empire. So it's all the more remarkable that this new regime kept Daniel on in this higher echelon of the dynasty. Not only that, he was appointed as the senior man in government, just below that of the king. But as I've said, just as racism was common today, it was commonplace in Daniel's time, and so was corruption and manipulation. In chapter 6 we read that the king appointed 120 satraps, or ministers if you like, and he had them to help him run this great empire. But he also appointed 3 presidents to keep an eye on them. He didn't fully trust them. And Daniel distinguished himself to such an extent that he was going to be the king's right-hand man. He was the senior member of this presidential threesome. Daniel was incorruptible. He was wise, and he was forthright with his advice. Some readers may have struggled to understand why Daniel was choosing to serve a foreign government, but this is where God had placed him, and this is his faithful tribute to God. Paul tells us in Romans that we should be obedient to the authorities who rule over us, and Daniel was simply fulfilling his duty as a godly man. Now, I'm not going to make any prejudicial or slanderous remarks about Middle Eastern or Arabic governments, but I'll leave this to your own thoughts. It was important for Daniel not to be corrupt. The king knew that, and Daniel knew that. Well, in those days, corruption was just as common as it is now in governments around the world in various countries. And being a provincial ruler was a very advantageous position. I'm sure that these satraps thought they were onto a really good thing, until they realised that their immediate line manager was David, a righteous and godly man who wasn't going to allow any corruption or profiteering. So they conspired together to bring him down. They appealed to the vanity of the king, who they manipulated with their flattery. Darius wasn't just simply vain, he was exceedingly short-sighted as a man. You would have thought he would have been suspicious, but he was carried along by the Uriah Heep type behaviour of his officials. They crawled around him, sycophants, and he fell for the plan. He signed a document which was designed to put an end to Daniel, though he didn't seem to recognise it at the time. In all the years I've read this story, it had never occurred to me before that the most obvious sign to Darius, or at least should have been, was the fact that he was being played by his officials, that Daniel was absent from the proposals. How did he not smell a rat? Well, the die was cast, but Daniel continued to pray in the morning, at lunchtime, and in the evening, just as he'd always done. Once again, the devil would have been muttering in his ear, "Oh, it won't matter just for these 30 days, if you don't pray, or you can just creep into a corner where nobody can see you and you can pray there." As one writer puts it, the real lion's den was actually in Daniel's home. That's where the real fight went on. Daniel resisted the devil, who was tempting, once again, to tease him away from his God. Well, what happened? Daniel once again said no. When you think of the pressure he was under, it is easy to forget how simple it would have been for him to take a different course, just for 30 days. But he said no. When Darius realizes that he's been tricked, and he has no option to action the edict which he had issued and signed, you can see immediately the distress that he's under, the recognition of his own foolishness. He has a sleepless night before rushing down to the lion's den at first light to see if Daniel had been protected by his God. He shouts down nervously to Daniel, presumably expecting there to be silence. But the response is clear. Daniel says, "O king, live forever." I once heard a preacher describe this as either sheer sarcasm from Daniel or perhaps unfettered respect. God had saved Daniel, our holy and righteous man, a man whose wisdom and faith makes him a true superhero in my mind. Of course, whilst we read of no wrong in Daniel's life, we know he is a sinner, and there is only one perfect person in the Bible. But the story of the lion's den is a fitting comparison to another incident in which temptation and injustice figure. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane said, "No," when there was that temptation to avoid the cross. Jesus was crucified because of injustice and corruption, just like Daniel, but both had the protection of God. I find it an encouragement in times of trials and temptation that we can be assured that we have God with us, just as Daniel did and as the Lord Jesus did during the crucifixion, even though he was separated. Jonathan reminded of this in an evening service a little while ago when he preached on Psalm 23. I think it's fitting to think of that when we think of God being with Daniel in the lion's den.